It is my pleasure this afternoon to introduce to those of you that are watching a longtime resident of the Saline County area. He's currently living in Pine Bluff area, but he is pursuing a master's. And his thesis is in an area I think you'll find quite interesting. We're going to give him a chance to present and kind of introduce you to the mechanics. And if you are interested, as I am, then I would think that we will provide him space or make access or give time so that he can complete that. You know, a lot of what we have experienced and known and been our history has gone to sleep with our forebears, our ancestors. But I like his angle of preservation and depositing in multiple repositories so that it can be preserved and the record can be made straight and plain. I appreciate that. His name is Brian Neel. And interestingly enough, he worked he attended church in his youth there at Ridgecrest Baptist. Many of you know where Neely and Reed Street come together. There's a church that's been there for many, many years. Used to be a store close by there as well. But he spent time there, graduated from Bauxite, and I'll let him talk. I think I've done enough. Brian Neel, in your hands.
Thank you very much, Pastor Barnes. I really appreciate it. What my goal here is, so I've lived most of my life in and around Saline County. My grandmother and grandfather built a house over there on Neely back in the 40s when they got married. So they lived there their whole lives, right there, right next to the Ralph Bunche community. And I grew up there because I spent so much time at my grandmother's house. Even though I went to school and lived in Bauxite, I spent most weekends and almost every Sunday at her house whenever we'd go to church. And then when I got older, in my late 20s, I worked at the Jimmy's Super Stop that's right over there next to the community for about 2.5 years. And I got to know so many people that lived in the community. And so as I've been going through my history program, I graduated with my bachelor's in May. And throughout that program, we were encouraged to think about what we might do for a master's thesis if we decided to go for a master's degree in history. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought that the story that is least told in history, from anything I can uncover, is small communities that used to be segregated in Arkansas. And, you know, Ralph Bunche community used to be Gravel Hill, I believe it was called.
Yes.
And definitely counts as one of those communities. And so there's stories about Little Rock and Fayetteville and big cities like Atlanta and Houston and Dallas, and what they went through with desegregation in the 1950s and 1960s and even into the 70s and 80s. But I don't see any of those stories about small communities, communities that aren't the big city or the capital cities. So I thought, why is that the case? What we should be doing is we should be telling all of those stories so that we know and understand what everybody's experience was in that I'm sure was not the same everywhere, or maybe was the same everywhere. But we can't understand that unless we actually hear their stories and not just focus on the big cities, because there's so much more to America than the big cities. And so what I want to do is I want to do an oral history project where I will interview people. My target goal is people who went to school from 1957 through 1970, anywhere in those years. Particularly in Ralph Bunche, those are going to be the important years because those were the years where some people started going to West Side and other schools in Benton that weren't the Ralph Bunche School. And I'm not trying to push anything or make a specific story come out of this, or get you to tell my story that I want to tell. I want you to tell your story, and for you to tell about where you lived and how you lived, and how desegregation might have affected your life, or if it did affect your life, because it may not have affected your life in ways that we expect or believe it did, based on where you lived, or who you lived with, or community you lived in, and not just your experience with desegregation, but I also am interested in the history of the Ralph Bunche community, because I'm sure there was a whole vibrant community system there, and history that is probably not known the way it should be. I'm not interested in just what your experience with desegregation was, but where you went to church, who you grew up with, what kind of things were done in the community, who you remember as being the important people in the community whenever you were growing up. So I want it to be more than just, hey, I want to talk about desegregation and school desegregation. I want to preserve the story and the memories of the people that lived through the 1950s, 1960s, early 1970s in that community, so that it's there and isn't just lost to history. Because we're getting into those years where very soon those stories aren't going to be around to tell anymore. So the interview process, it's really kind of open to interpretation. It's open to what you want to do. There's kind of a 3-step process of the interview. The first step is that anyone who would like to participate, we would need to do a pre-interview. So I'm not just going to sit down in a room with you and have you record your whole life story without talking to me, because you're not going to trust me. I'm not going to know what to ask you. And we're not going to get a very good telling of your story, of what your lived experience is, if we do it that way. So, anyone that would like to, we can have a conversation on the phone. We could do a conversation over Zoom. If you're comfortable, really the best way is to try to do something in person, maybe meet over a cup of coffee or lunch or dinner or something like that. And then, I would just get to know you. That way I have some notes on what kinds of things to ask you in the interview. And so also that you can get an opportunity to ask me any questions that you want to ask, in order to feel like you can trust me to be the person you tell your story to. Because that's really important. If you don't trust me enough to be able to tell me any of the details, then you're probably not going to. And that's just the fact of the matter.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't expect anyone to just tell their whole life story to someone they've never met and feel like they can't trust at all. So I definitely want to get to know you. The interview would then take place. Of course, there might be a couple of pre-interviews. If you met me once, but you still didn't feel comfortable having a recording, you wanted to meet again to talk a little more or have a couple of phone conversations, we can do that. With whatever would make you feel more comfortable with this process. And then when we actually interview, I will have a list of basic kind of formulated questions that I will ask you, and you'll have a chance to read those. And any of those that you are like, no, I don't want to answer anything relating to that, you can just cross it off the list. But it is important to be aware that, of course, during the course of an interview, there may be things that you say that I have to ask questions about that I can't prepare in advance. But of course, if there's something you don't want to talk about, you have full rights anytime during the interview process to say, no, I really don't want to talk about that. And then the third stage is after the interview is done, I will make sure anyone that does an interview with me gets to listen to what we've recorded. And if there's something you're not comfortable with having said in the interview and you want it stricken from the record, we can edit it, take that out of the interview. If you want the full interview to be able to be published, but you want to wait like 5 or 10 years, or perhaps after your passing many years from now, then we can do that. Whatever is most comfortable for you. What's important is that we preserve these stories, even if we have to wait a little while before it can be part of the public memory. And I would make sure everything that I do is stored in at least 3 places, on my computer and on at least 2 thumb drives. My goal is also to archive it somewhere with an archival center. Now, this would be something that I'd have to discuss with people that we are interviewing, because some of you may not want it in an archive. Some of you may want it, or may want it in a specific archive if you're familiar with the archival process and want it a specific place and not where I end up ultimately deciding it should go. We can definitely discuss that, decide where it needs to ultimately reside permanently. But I also ideally at some point would like to create a website that there would be a release process on your information on the recording where you would sign what you're willing to do. And I would definitely have an item on there, whether you're willing to have it published on a website. And if you're not, that's fine. But ultimately what I would like to do, if this goes really well and I build a good project for Ralph Bunch, is I'd like to do this in other communities all across the state and kind of build like maybe a little map on a website where you see where all these little communities were in Arkansas, because I think that would give so many people a better understanding that Arkansas may not look quite like what a lot of people think it looked like over the last 60, 70, 80 years. And I think that would be really good for a lot of people to have a better understanding of that.
Brian, just a quick question. Do you think, oh boy, I didn't even see my picture come up. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Do you think the research later on might prove valuable to people even after we're gone? I'm just using that, but down the road, few decades, as they try to gather information about a previous era, they want to do research and get a better picture. Would your archived collection of audio and whatnot be available for future research?
Yes, that's the goal. Of course, like I said, some people might want to have it wait, 10 or 15 or 20 years down the road before it's available for people to publish any research they do. That's kind of common with the oral history archival process. But I do think, history is one of the few avenues that we have to build community. You can do so much community building by sharing history broadly with the people who live around you. And I think that there has been almost something of an oral history revolution over the last 20 to 30 years. And I think that there is going to be more of that in the coming years, where people use these stories of communities that previously just got forgotten, to better understand where we've come from and where we still need to go in our society to become a better community. Because as I'm sure we all know, we all still have a long way to go to be a harmonious society where we all love each other as fellow citizens of this country, because there's an awful lot of places we're lacking in that right now. And I think these kind of stories can help us fix that.
Well, when you say it like that, makes me think about, and you and I talked about this before, that StoryCorps concept. I don't know if a lot of our listeners are familiar with NPR, National Public Radio, and whatever. Anyway, this whole national project of stories being read into an archive, collected, or whatever. What distinguishes what you're doing from that concept?
So this is longer form, obviously. So StoryCorps, usually I don't think I've seen anything on there longer than like 7 minutes.
Right.
The interviews I would be doing are much longer form. The recorded part of it would be anywhere from 30 minutes to sometimes interviews are 2 hours or more. Of course, it's all what the person I'm interviewing is comfortable with. But there are sometimes where, say I do an interview with you and we have a great interview and, you've given me this really amazing story and then I want to elaborate on it more, maybe we do multiple interviews.
Ah,
Um,
I was going to ask that.
if I'm doing an interview with you and say, maybe you just have so much wealth of knowledge of your community and other communities, or maybe this really amazing story, of how your life went whenever you were a kid and growing up, or I'm sure I may at some point meet someone that might be a veteran or something like that might have these great stories of that experience. And so there may be stuff that you want to elaborate on in future interviews. It's more than just, I have a thing I want to talk about in my project, but the interview process is also for you as an individual. Maybe you just want to share your story for posterity so that somewhere out there in the ether, all the things that you remembered as your life is there. And these things would also be accessible to the public. So say you want these stories available for your children or grandchildren or family members or other community members to be able to access. That's a great thing about this process too, is then those are there for those people that want to learn about their own history, because Ralph Bunch isn't going anywhere. It's still going to be there 20, 30, 40, 50, whoever knows how many years from now. And there's going to be people that live there and want to know, what was this place I live in like 100 years ago?
Well, let me also add that I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, we have individuals, we've kind of got a diaspora going on. People have moved other places, careers, whatever, marriages have carried them out of the community. And of course, it's not as vibrant or populated as it used to be. But those individuals, perhaps would there be an opportunity for them to also interview? You may not be able to do it in person, like you said a moment ago about possible Zoom or phone conference or something. Um, and then I don't know, they used to have before the pandemic an annual Ralph Bunch reunion. And so some people would come back, for that. However,
Sure.
some of, because I forgot the date that ended, but about 67, 68, the elementaries closed, but the high school was the first one to close in about, early on. They might have gone into the early 70s. But anyway, I'm just saying, as stories are related, then cross-reference, because somebody else will make mention of the same thing, uh, or instance, I've been in the same class under the same teacher or a certain project or whatever. I'm just, but if those things correlate or cross-reference, that might necessitate a second part to the interview or additional. I don't know how you're gonna find enough time with that many people.
Sure.
Uh,
It does get to be a process. My goal, long term goal, is that this could grow into something that is, communities across Arkansas, or maybe even one day across the South. So people that have moved away and would still, say you have an uncle or a brother or a sister or something like that moved away, but you're seeing this and thinking, they'd be great to do this. I might call them and ask them if
yeah,
they'd like to meet with him. I would love that. Or say you just moved to Ralph Bunch, but you lived in another community and grew up in the 1950s and 1960s in another community. I'm still interested in your story, because as much as I would love to do a history of Ralph Bunch, I also, my main goal here is a story of community, of people who lived and worked and loved and worshiped and did all of the things that we do as human beings in these communities during a time that was difficult. Um, the 1950s and 1960s, 1970s, as difficult as some things are today, there was a lot going on in those decades.
Pretty turbulent. Yeah, you're right. A
You know,
lot
with
of change occurring, shifting.
desegregation and the Cold War and Vietnam and the Civil Rights
Don't forget the
Movement.
draft. Yeah, Vietnam and the draft. That was something that really did affect this community. That was an explosion of population in the community as people were shifting, concerning the draft. They came to the plants, at Bauxite, Reynolds, and Alcoa. And I remember that. Just a quick story. When I was a kid, everybody walked around in the community, nobody locked their doors, churches remained open, you just walk in, etc. But then all of a sudden there was an explosion of people that you didn't really know. So instead of sitting out on the porch, people were looking through a curtain on the window, or before you get in trouble, if you didn't speak to everybody that you passed by sitting out on the porch, by the time you got home, your parents already knew that Miss So-and-so or somebody called, da, 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 da. But then when there's all these people that you don't really know, it just changed that whole social dynamic that had been, just I don't know quite what to call it. But anyway, that was something everybody observed. And it was subtle, but it happened right there just prior to the mid 60s and then moving forward.
And those are the exact kind of stories I'm interested in too, is knowing how things changed and how things didn't change in the community as you grew up. Because something, the old saying, some things change and some things stay the same.
That's true. Well, all right. I certainly, is there anything else you need to add to that? I'm going to send you a link or something so you can look at that. And if in case you need to tweak it or whatever, we can do that. But
Sure, no. I think we covered basically everything. Just the most important part here is this is something I'm really excited about to do, because I love the idea of people telling and sharing their stories, because it just doesn't happen
oh yeah,
enough, I don't think.
first person. I like that first person narrative of the story. Yeah, I mean, we hear other folks' stories and we rehearse them and pass them on, but in the first person, I really like that. And we want to catch as many as possible before dementia or whatever, different little things that when they got a moment of clarity or things they related to their children, or their children can be near and prompt them, that would be great too. I see a lot of potential in what you're saying, but I also feel like you're probably going to need somebody that will buy into your project and clone yourself.
Well,
work.
my current I'm taking an oral history class right now, and he has a lot of experience with building these kind of projects into something
Okay.
where we have multiple interviewers. So if this were to go really well and I can expand this to communities, there may be some avenue for having some people pounding the pavement, so to speak.
I got you. I got you. All right. Well, I certainly appreciate you taking this time on a Sunday afternoon. And as I forestated, I'll send you a link so you can look at that and tell me yay and nay, kind of like what you said about the interview process. If they say, I know a lot of things, what is that, presidential stuff, 25 years later, they want a 25-year period before it really goes out to the public. But anyway, I think most of us, we live long enough. It'll go out. So thank you again.
Thank you so much
How do you
for
spell your
this.
last name?
It's Neel.
N-E-E or
Neel.
N-E-A? N-E-A-L.
Neel.
Oh,
Spelled
E-E.
the same
Double E.
as Neely Street.
Oh, okay.
Neel.
Except for the Y.
Yep.
Okay. All right, we got you. We all know Neely because we used to walk to school, go down to Neely, Palm, cross the Neely, and over the tracks up to Edison and across Edison and on up. Yeah, Fourth
So
Street.
they
I know.
blocked off those tracks anyway.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. They got a Second Street overpass now. That's a story too. I have to tell you about that. But all right, God bless you. Have a good evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you too. Have a wonderful day.
All right, you too.